Hello, YouTubers. I am Angela Logan, and this is Everyday Shenanigans. It is Wednesday, Hump Day, November 20th, 2019. Thanks for joining me, subscribers, viewers. Hello, hello. I've got to send a shout out to my brother, Mr. James Joyner, aka Buck. Everybody knows him. He's well known in Knox Vegas. Hello, brother. Thanks for talking to me last night. Hope you enjoyed your seafood. Okay, now I want to get to a story that has been a story that's happened years ago. It was a very controversial story that transpired here in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was of a double murder of two Caucasian young people. They were a couple, and very high profile case. I gave an update in one of my earlier videos of one of the defendants who was brought up on murder charges, and I'm going to give you the said information. So if you need any reference to the information that I'm giving you today, please backtrack to my earlier videos where you will learn, get information about the said case. Okay. Here we go. This will be probably a lengthy video because there's so much involved in the details. So bear with me. But please enjoy the ride, okay? All right. Now, this case was about Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom. As I stated, a young couple who were dating, and they were found brutally, they were carjacked, kidnapped, and brutally murdered. And this is one of the defendants in the case who was brought up on murder charges recently, a few months ago, and found guilty in that. And I'll backtrack and give you the information, but I want to start with the latest information, then I will backtrack. Judge will issue written ruling on Eric Boyd's request for a new trial. Boyd was convicted in September for his role in the deaths of Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom. The man convicted for his role in the murders and kidnappings of a young Knoxville couple is asking for a new trial. A judge handed down 2 life sentences for Eric Boyd in September for participating in the 2007 kidnaps, rapes, robberies, and murders of Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom. In court on Friday, the defense argued that Boyd didn't get a fair trial because of excessive media coverage and said there was no physical evidence tying him to the crimes. Okay? Remember I said that. Prosecutors countered that physical evidence didn't matter because Boyd was part of the group that carjacked the couple on the night of January 6, 2007 and bore criminal responsibility. The judge said he will consider the arguments and will issue a written ruling later in the next few weeks. The defense asked that Boyd be returned to federal custody, where he had been serving his time after being convicted on federal carjacking charges related to the murders. The judge refused that request, saying he will be held in Knox County until he makes his decision. Okay, the victims were raped at or near a rental home on Chipman Street. Newsom was shot to death and his body was burned on railroad tracks near the rental home. Christian suffocated after being bound and stuffed in a trash can in the rental home. Evidence showed that Boyd brought Newsom back to the rental home after the carjacking. A co-defendant, George Thomas, testified at trial in August that he and Boyd forced Newsom to go to a remote location near the house where Boyd shot and killed him. Thomas testified that Davidson remained in a house with Christian as Boyd set Newsom's body on fire and killed him. Last week, Lamarcus Davidson, 38, was before a judge arguing new information had surfaced since his 2009 trial that factored in his case. That request for a new trial was denied. So a judge saw fit in Lamarcus Davidson to deny him a new trial due to this new evidence of George Thomas, it's complicated people, who got with prosecutors last year to say he had information to give that Mr. Boyd was a participant in the carjacking and murders. And so now Lamarcus decides to file a suit to say, well, hey, since this new information has come out, hey, I'd like a new trial. But the judge basically said, hey, no matter if this case that came before us with Mr. Boyd on murder charges, it wouldn't factor in what was seen as evidence in your original case. So that's the latest update, that Mr. Boyd is now trying to get a new trial in his case, where he was just sentenced in September for 2 life consecutive sentences plus 90 years in prison. And now Lamarcus Davidson, the other co-defendant who has been deemed the ringleader, now wanted a new trial, but that motion was denied by a judge. I now want to give you all information in the case for those of you who did not follow this case, and it reads as follows. I made an earlier video, and I was pretty hard on Mr. Boyd because I thought to myself, I never wanted to think that he was guilty, because naturally you want to weigh all evidence. And if there was never any physical evidence, then why would I think, that he was a participant? Just because he knew the people doesn't mean he was a defendant or a cohort, whichever word you want to use, co-conspirator. I like to go with evidence, because everybody's got friends and associates. It doesn't mean because I knew you or I talked to you after you did something means I was a participant or Joe Blow was a participant. So, I'm one of those type of people. Show me proof. Okay. This trial, Mr. Boyd getting this double life sentence plus 90 years came because Mr. Thomas, George Thomas, went to the prosecutors and told them he had evidence as of last year that Mr. Boyd was a participant. Naturally, as I stated, Mr. Boyd originally got a sentence earlier in the trial, when everybody was getting tried, because it was like 5 people getting tried. So he had a sentence of, what was it saying, 18 years. And then here comes Mr. Thomas saying, no, years later, mind you, 11 years later or so, he's saying, no, he went along for the ride as well. He participated in the murder as well, the carjacking, rape, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So it was up to you as an outsider to decide, did Mr. Boyd participate in these said crimes? As I stated, he was found guilty on 2 life sentences plus 90 years, and he is now appealing and wanting a new trial. Okay. The charges were felony murder, first-degree murder, aggravated robbery, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated rape, and this was a 36-count indictment that Mr. Boyd stood account for and charged with. Where I have the problem with this case, because as I stated, you go back to my previous videos, I was hard on him. I said only if he did this. Only if he was involved. Because as I stated originally, he got a lighter sentence for having information after the fact. After the fact. So what I found odd was, how is it that all these years later, none of the other co-defendants ever mentioned him, ever mentioned that he was a co-conspirator with the robbery, kidnapping, rapes of both young people. And then years later, here comes Mr. Thomas saying otherwise. Yes, he was there. So that was one of my questions I had for this case, is why all of a sudden did George Thomas decide to give information that Mr. Boyd was involved, and why did the other co-defendants ever mention Mr. Boyd as being a co-conspirator years ago? You would think everybody had some part in these 2 said crimes against these 2 young people. Why didn't they name Eric at the time? So I do find that suspicious. Okay. Also, Lamarcus was sentenced to death, and as I stated, the ringleader. He wanted a new trial, but as you see, that was denied. And his brother, Latavius Cobbins, received life without parole. George Thomas, who is the friend of Latavius Cobbins, originally, he had received a 127-year sentence. But now, since he decided to fold and roll on his new friend, he gets a 50-year sentence with the possibility of parole. He got his sentence cut, as you see, facing 127 years originally, and then decides to roll over on this guy who none of the other co-defendants ever mentioned him in the crimes at all. Now he gets a reduced sentence of 50 years with the possibility of parole. So mind you, he'll be way up near 70-something when they let him out, mid-60s. If he gets paroled early, he could possibly get out in his mid-60s because he's now in his late 30s, 36 or whatever. Okay, so Cobbin's girlfriend, another defendant, co-defendant, she was deemed a facilitator, and she got 35 years. About 2 years or so ago, she went up for parole, and that was denied. She mumbled something about wanting to be a hairdresser and all that in her statement before the parole board, but that naturally got debunked. Okay, so as I stated, we have the ringleader, Mr. Lamarcus Davison, who is facing death. His brother, Latavius Cobbins, is serving life without parole. Cobbins' friend, George Thomas, who is the one who rolled over on Mr. Eric Boyd here recently, Latavius is receiving life without parole. George Thomas, who now has a reduced sentence of 50 years with parole. And then there was the girlfriend of Cobbins, and she received 35 years. Okay. This is a very interesting tale, unlike any situation I've ever seen. But I'm going to mention some things that, like I said, I found odd with the story, the new testimony that Mr. Thomas has given. What I find odd is, as I stated, why didn't the other co-defendants mention Mr. Boyd as a co-conspirator? Why did you wait years later to say he was there and went along with the murders, the kidnapping, rapes, and murders? Okay. There were no doors on inside of this house, which stood at about 800 feet. So you all know that's pretty small. Okay, so Mr. Thomas acts as if he never heard Shannon crying out, saying no, when Latavius was assaulting her, sexually assaulting her. So that was always argued in the beginning, in the court trials years ago. You know, hey, there's no way anybody who was there could not have heard the sexual assault against this young lady because there were no doors. Now, you all can think about that. Living in a house or an apartment, can you imagine no doors being on any of the rooms? So you know noise is going to travel when there are no doors in a room. I mean, on a room. And it doesn't really matter what the size is. The size of a house, once you have no doors to close off the sound, you can hear things quite well. So I thought that was suspicious. Okay. Davison and Cobbins, who are the brothers, naturally there was DNA to corroborate that they had raped the young lady. And for some of you who do not know, Chris, the boyfriend, who was found nearby some railroad tracks, he was also raped and set afire, which is a horrible death. And his death was just as horrible as Shannon's death, because Shannon, as the article stated, was raped and bleach was poured over her, down her mouth and private areas to conceal DNA, and she was stuffed inside of a garbage can head first, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry if these details are graphic. I won't go into, anymore. If you want to find out, you'll have to backtrack to the earlier court information pertaining to this case, because I didn't want to get into all of that. But I'm just basically telling you about Mr. Boyd wanting a new trial and George Thomas being the one who gave this new information recently that led to him being found guilty of the rape and murder, kidnapping, and said crimes. So those were the things that was on my mind about this, about Mr. Boyd being a co-conspirator after the fact of the murder and kidnapping and robbery. Doors not being on. Why did the other defendants never say anything over the years? And this was a statement that Miss Coleman gave, Vanessa. And this is a very interesting statement. And this is earlier in the trial. She gave a statement saying that Davison told Thomas that Newsom had been taken care of. So why would Davison tell that Thomas was with Boyd on the shooting, at the shooting. You understand what I'm saying? If Thomas is now saying that he and Boyd went to this area to dispose of Mr. Chris Newsom, then why would Davidson have told Vanessa what she heard an earshot rather? Why would Davidson have told George, oh, he's been taken care of? You hear what I'm saying? Now this is Vanessa's version. That Davidson told George, oh, Chris has been taken care of. Why would he tell him that if he had already been with Boyd to kill Chris? Although he's acting as if he stayed behind and stayed in the car, and that Boyd went on, shot the boy, set him afire. He claims that he waited inside of Shannon's car. I know it's confusing for those who haven't followed. But you see what I'm saying? Something is odd about that because that's two different versions. And they're saying also that the investigators are basically, I guess they're in awe of George's newfound testimony because, as this girl states, who was the girlfriend who was at the house at the time when the girl was brought back and who was kidnapped and brought back to this small house with no doors, she overhears Davidson telling Thomas, hey, Chris is taken care of. So how is it now, fast forward 11, 12 years later, you're telling the state and jury members and the public that you went to another site with Boyd and you waited while Boyd killed him and you sat in a car, but this girl is saying years ago you were at the house and LaMarcus Davidson told you that he was taken care of. So why would LaMarcus have to tell you he was taken care of, that Chris was taken care of, if you were already there and committed the crime? Do you all see where I'm going now? Okay? That's what's weird about George Thomas's new testimony, is that he's basically saying, I went with Boyd. I didn't want to participate in the murder. He tried to get me to, I guess, manhandle him or whatever to get him out to where he was. But I sat by in the girl's car, the victim's car, and he shot him 2 times. But that same gun was never recovered. But the holster for the .22 was found in the car, in the cousin's glove box of her vehicle that they borrowed to initiate the carjacking in the first place. And this case was stemmed on a carjacking scenario. So for those who haven't followed, this was a bunch of people, friends, associates, decided to go out looking for a car to steal. Mr. LaMarcus, the ringleader, that's how he's been deemed. He has told these other people, hey, let's go out and steal a car. They go out and steal a car. They leave Vanessa Coleman, who is Latavius' girlfriend, behind. She allegedly testified in her, hearing that she just stayed behind. But naturally, we know she had to have heard the cries of the young lady, blah, blah, blah. So it's up to your interpretation once you get all the information. Do you believe this newfound information that Mr. Thomas gave the court and to the jury panel, that Mr. Boyd was a willing participant in the carjacking and rape, carjacking, kidnapping, rape, and murder of the 2 young people, Shannon and Chris. And like I said in my earlier video a few months back, I was very hard on Mr. Boyd, but I made it clear that if he had participated, he was a piece of you-know-what. I did say that because I thought to myself, all this time, some of us thought you had no participation. We thought it was just LaMarcus needed a place to hide out after they, had murdered the 2 young people, and you came in contact with him. And then the police investigated you as just somebody who hid him out. But once I was getting information of this last trial of Mr. Boyd, a lot of information came out that I didn't know about, years before, that there was a cousin whose car Mr. Boyd used, that they had went to different addresses trying to find somewhere to stay. and I think it was the cousin's house or some other young lady's house that lived in the College Hills, which most of us call the Ville. And she didn't want them staying in her house naturally. She was going out of town or something. She had told them so they couldn't stay there. And of course, I could understand that. Who would want someone staying, in their home, an acquaintance, while they go out of town? So, see, all that information I had never heard before years back with this case, with these people who were on trial for said crimes. But all this came out. Now, naturally, DNA was found on Mr. Boyd's pants of a male gender, but it was not that of Chris Newsom's DNA. So, as I stated in that earlier video, it seems that Mr. Boyd has a, what is the word I want to use? He has a liking of the male sex. We'll leave it at that. Okay. So, one could say, interesting, because as I stated, some of you who had not followed the case, Mr. Newsom was raped. Yes, the male victim was raped by one of them or more. I always found it odd when this case arose again, as Mr. Boyd being a co-conspirator in the kidnapping, rape, murder, robbery, because I had to think in my mind, how did they get to the crime in the first place to steal a car? So that means somebody had to sit in the car with the victims, and somebody had to drive the original car that got them to the scene. Because we knew that 5 defendants could not have sat comfortably in this SUV that the young lady drove. So naturally, 2 of the victims would probably be in one car, and then there would be a driver, a passenger in the front. There's your 2 defendants, and then possibly one more defendant in the back with the victims, I would assume. Okay, so there's your 5 passengers there, 3 co-conspirators and the 2 victims. So 3 in one car, which was the victim's car, and then one other person would have had to drive the car that got them to the scene. And so they relied on Mr. Boyd for transportation because they did not have a car of their own. So one could say they used Mr. Boyd's cousin's car, because that was found out that he had borrowed a cousin's car, Mr. Boyd, to drive around, just in general. And I believe that car was linked to the crime as the car that they used to go to look for someone to carjack. And naturally, as I stated, a holster was found in the glove box, a .22 holster, but no gun was retrieved or ever found and linked to this case. So, is it possible that Mr. Boyd, yes, used his cousin's car to take these people out to carjack someone, and this was the car linked to the crime, because he did use that cousin's car, I guess, on occasions to run around or whatever, and then it was possibly linked to this case. Now, naturally, testimony from that cousin was iffy and differential, because I think she played possum as to not remembering the details about the case from years ago. I think she had got a touch of amnesia as far as the car situation, and had she loaned the car on that said day in September of 2007. So yes, you guys, this is a very old case that transpired back in January of 2007, and I was just bringing you all an update that Mr. Eric Boyd is trying to get another trial, and the judge will render a decision in the next upcoming weeks. And Mr. George Thomas, who was originally sentenced to 127 years for his participation, rolled over on Mr. Boyd, someone who was never implicated in the carjacking, robbery, rape, and murder of Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom. He received a 18-year sentence for, I guess, knowledge of, after the fact, harboring a fugitive. That was his original sentence that he received. But with the new testimony from Mr. George Thomas stating that he was a co-conspirator he now has been given a sentence of 2 consecutive life sentences plus 90 years that he is now wanting a new trial for. Yes, honey, that's a lot of information. And it's a lot because there were so many people involved. 2 victims, both were Caucasian. 4 original defendants of the said crimes, which are African American, and Mr. Boyd, who is a friend of Lamarcus Davidson, who is also, he is African American. So you're talking about 5 cohorts that are African American who assaulted and killed these 2 Caucasian young people. And so it was a big to-do here in Knoxville. It was a very high profile crime and trial, and there was a lot of information given, and I never thought I would see that it would, resurface and come back, but it did. And this is the information that I decided to bring you guys, because as I told you, I would bring, various subject matters on this channel, and this is something that has arisen with Mr. Boyd. He's seeking a new trial, and then Lamarcus got wind of the trial that transpired back in August, and so he decided to get an attorney to seek getting a new trial because George decided to give new information, but as I stated, that was debunked by a judge. Whew. It's so much. It's like, wow, because it's hard to explain it to someone who was not familiar with the case. If you had never heard of this, trial of these co-defendants, and the slayings of these 2 young people, 2 bright young people. It was a travesty. It is a travesty to be taken out like that. And that is the point I've made in several of my videos, is that this incident took place back in 2007. So now you fast forward to 2019, and as you see, you still have people who get in cahoots to hurt and harm, rob people, kidnap people, and get people to go along. These people conspired together. They didn't have to go along. And this is one case that I stand firmly on that was so foul and vile and disrespectful to a human. And the fact that they were African American, it just stunned me, and it stunned lots of people. Lots of people were stunned because we were like, dang, you would stoop this low to kill these kids like this? Why? Over what? You did all this to them, tortured them, and they didn't even keep the car. How you think they found the car? GPS. So what was the point of stealing the car? To do what in? To do nothing. To kill these kids for nothing. And you all went along with it. Friends of a friend, brother, whoever, girlfriend. Sickening that you all would go along with this. That's what I find baffling. It's that Lamarcus Davidson was able to talk these random people. Some he had just met. Some he knew. He knew his brother, of course, Latavius. But the girl, Vanessa, George, and Latavius came from Kentucky, and they came down. And how they got themselves wrapped up with Davidson is a mystery to me, to even go along with this heinous crime against these 2 young people. But I can say personally, I am glad this is over. If God knows more than this case, then hopefully the truth will be revealed again if it has to go back to court. But as I stated, no evidence linked Mr. Boyd to the Chipman Street house, or I guess to the 2 victims, just Mr. George Thomas's re-account rather, that he was a participant. But I tell you what I find baffling, because this state is a funny state as far as that getting in cahoots with people. You rob somebody and play that I sat in the car, I stood at the door, I was on the porch, I was filing my fingernails, all that crazy nonsense. If the person dies, a weapon is used, whatever, you take the ride. So I find it funny, years later, he comes forward to say, hey, Mr. Boyd went along for the ride. Now he gets a cut sentence of 50 years. But you had knowledge from what the girl says, the girlfriend of Mr. Latavius, the other brother, that you knew that Chris got taken care of. And you had to have known that that Shannon died in that house, because you stayed in that house and you was there with them. And like they said, there were no doors. So you heard everything that went on in there, and you were a willing participant and heard that girl's cries, I'm sure, and her demise when he stuffed her in that garbage can. And I know, I jogged my memory back in testimony from, I think, Latavius and Vanessa, that they all stood like little army men watching DeMarcus, make sure I'm saying the name correctly, put her in that can, and y'all watched that girl die in that garbage can. And now here it comes years later, you want to play crazy and now say this other guy was along. I don't know if Mr. Boyd was there or not, but as I stated in my video, if he was a piece of you-know-what, if he did go along with the robbery, rape, and murder. But you were at that house that night. And how I know you was at the house, because like you said, you didn't know anything about Knoxville, Tennessee. You didn't know anything about the area you were when you allegedly went to the place where Boyd got rid of Chris. So you was at that house when Shannon died and was murdered. And you heard everything that went on with her sexual assault in that house. You had to at some point. You knew something. Even if you stepped out on y'all little joyride, as you stated, you still knew that she was assaulted and she was in that house because the house had no doors. Now, what and if Boyd participated in the carjacking and the rapes and the murders? I don't know. As I stated, I didn't even want to believe that he participated. I just thought he was someone that knew Davidson needed a place to hide out afterwards. But as I stated, if he did those crimes with them, he is garbage as well. We will see what happens if he gets a new trial. But that's my update on the Eric Boyd wanting a new trial. And if you all want to follow this case, please go back and Google the information, because it's long, it's winded, because each person had a trial that was a co-defendant. So you're talking about 5 trials and a lot of hearings and this and that. And it's a long saga. It's about as ratchet as the other case I talk about on here. Yeah. It's that bad. Thanks for watching, you guys. Thanks for listening. Thanks for my new subscribers. I want to thank you all. I'm very humbled for this experience here on YouTube, and I will be bringing you more updates. I have one more update to bring you this evening, but I want to thank you guys so very much. You all have a safe week, and I'll be back with more information. Ladies, stay safe. Parents, mind your children. Checking out of here. Bye-bye.